When Laura Bell quietly passed away in her small cottage in 1894, few knew of the notorious life she had led. In her earlier years, she was a renowned courtesan who lived a life of passion, power and wealth, and was even dubbed the Queen of London Whoredom. Join me as we explore her story. Laura Eliza Jane Seymour Bell was born in 1829 in the village of Glenavy in Northern Ireland. She came from a respectable family who were fairly well off, as her father, Captain Robert Henry Bell, managed the estates of the 4th Marquess of Hertford, Richard Seymour Conway. Meanwhile, Laura's mother, named Laura Jane Seymour, was alleged to be the illegitimate daughter of Francis Seymour Conway, a British Tory politician and the 3rd Marquess of Hertford. Despite Laura's links to affluent figures, she is thought to have had a neglectful childhood, and she eventually left her small village around the age of 14 and headed to Belfast to start her own life. There she found work as a shop assistant, but also turned to occasional prostitution in order to earn the extra income she needed to support herself. After working in Belfast for some time, she moved on to Dublin, where she would frequent the avenues of Phoenix Park in her own carriage. You may wonder how she could afford this at such a young age. Well, Laura was by all accounts an incredibly beautiful young woman, one who was increasingly sought out by powerful and wealthy men who wanted her attention. For example, one man who it's believed that she engaged in an affair with at this time was the well-established Dr. William Wilde, the father of the famed writer Oscar Wilde. With the ability to seduce powerful and wealthy clients, Laura took her business to the next level. By now, she had accumulated enough gifts and money from her lovers that in 1849, she ventured to London to find even wealthier suitors. It was here that she truly became a renowned courtesan, known as the Queen of London Whoredom. This was due to the fact that she had a vast clientele, ranging from dukes to politicians. This is no surprise considering her attractiveness, and a statement regarding Laura from the time claimed that, on one occasion at the opera, the entire house rose simultaneously to look at her as she was leaving. By now, Laura had gained quite a reputation in London, and she lived up to it. Just as she had done in Dublin, she would frequent the streets of London in her coach, predominantly riding around Hyde Park in her gilt carriage, which was pulled by 2 stunning white horses. Her beauty would attract the attention of onlookers, but even more so when she was riding in her lavish carriage. On one occasion as she was riding around Hyde Park, she caught the attention of the Nepalese Prime Minister, young Bahadur Rana, who was absolutely smitten with her at first glance. Young was eager to get the attention of Laura, and he found it. He soon had her settled into a luxurious residence in Belgravia, central London, and the two began an affair. The Nepalese Prime Minister showered her with luxurious gifts, and it's reported that he would go on to spend around £250,000 on Laura, equivalent to around £26 million today. The affair between the two was no secret, and a Bristol newspaper even wrote an article on their relationship in 1850. The article reads, "The Nepalese ambassador leaves this country this week, and takes with him a young English girl of surpassing beauty and evil spirit, a second Lola Montez, whom she must equally encourage to trust herself alone among the Nepalese warriors and their wives. Her Majesty has been, it is said, much scandalized by the appearance of this young lady in the Nepalese ambassador's box at the opera, the said one being next to the one occupied by Her Majesty herself. The name of the person alluded to is Laura Bell. She is of a respectable Irish family, but has been living for some time in London a life of open extravagant profligacy. Her carriage is one of the most stylish equipages there, might usually be seen at the ton hour in the park." After all the expense that Young had poured over the young courtesan, he also gave her a ring as a token of his affection, and promised to fulfill her every wish. Years later, after the Nepalese Prime Minister had left England, Laura sent him a personal request to aid the British in the Sepoy Mutiny of 1857. As part of her request, she had also included the ring that Young had once given her as a gift, and despite the division in the Nepalese court over the decision to aid the British, it was Young himself who led the troops to the gates of Lucknow. Despite all the luxury that Young had given Laura, she still found herself in financial difficulty. She was running up debts on luxury items, and at one point was even arrested and nearly put in prison as a result. Then, on the 21st of January 1852, Laura married a wealthy army captain by the name of Augustus Frederick Thistlethwaite. Thistlethwaite's godfather was a Duke of Sussex, and due to a large inheritance, he was very wealthy. This gave Laura more options to run up large bills on lavish items, but her relentless spending caused tension in the relationship, and the couple frequently argued. Things got so bad that Thistlethwaite ended up telling store owners and craftsmen that she had no money to pay for future items, and that they shouldn't sell her anything. 6 months later, she ran off with Arthur Henry Thistlethwaite, her husband's wealthier younger brother, who had received a larger part of the inheritance. He was a respected army officer, but their liaison wouldn't last long, as in 1853 he went off to fight in the Crimean War. He was present at the Battle of the Alma and fought bravely, but despite this, he passed away from disease in November 1854 at Scutari. After hearing of her lover's death and realizing that her legal husband had inherited the entirety of his brother's fortune, she experienced a sudden conversion and returned to him. Following this, the couple lived unhappily in London, where Augustus is said to have been moody and grumpy. Despite her flaws, Laura was still extremely popular, so much so that a carte de visite was made of her. These were small photographs that were mounted, measuring approximately 2.5 by 4 inches, and had been patented in Paris by photographer André Adolphe Eugène d'Istardy in 1854. Initially, these cards hadn't taken off, but after the Emperor Napoleon III had his own, they went on to become a huge success. Victorians began trading them with one another much like trading cards today, and Laura soon found her own portrait being traded with high-powered individuals such as the Prince of Wales, Napoleon Bonaparte, the Duke of Wellington, General Tom Thumb, and many others. By now, Laura was a partially retired courtesan, and in the height of the carte de visite craze, she met a man by the name of William Ewart Gladstone, a British statesman and leader of the Liberal Party, who would go on to become Prime Minister. Gladstone was interested in the plight of London's prostitutes and began walking the streets of London at night in the hopes of rescuing and reforming prostitutes in the 1840s. By the mid-1860s, he had met Laura, and some people claim he was the man responsible for her reformation, but this wasn't entirely true. In 1856, Laura's husband went to see the converted pugilist preacher Richard Weaver deliver a sermon, after which he converted to Christianity. Weaver was known to be an exceptionally hard man, who had been brought up by a drunk and violent father. Weaver himself had found work in the pits and solace in the bottle, and often found himself taking part in bare fist fights. Weaver had a Christian wife, and after listening to his wife's and other Christians' testimonies about God, he found himself converting, and went on to become a well-known devout evangelist. Thistlethwaite went home after hearing Weaver preach, and began to talk to Laura about God. Laura also found herself converting to the faith, and after some studying, Laura and her husband began to preach to others about the glory of God. It was Laura especially who gained fame as a reformed preacher. Her sermons were zealous and mesmerizing, and she quickly gained an ardent following. One visitor to a sermon of Laura's published his thoughts, stating, "Precisely at 3 o'clock a side door on the platform was opened, and I at once recognised Mrs. Thistlethwaite. She looks in the very prime of womanhood. Her beautiful light brown hair was worn perfectly plain, and on her head she a little black bonnet, well thrown back with a ruche inside, and long strings of tulle hanging down. She has a soft yet powerful and admirably modulated voice, but she opens her mouth to a greater extent more than is necessary, probably with a desire to give as much volume as possible to her voice. Upon this subject, she enlarged for nearly an hour, with a propriety of expression, an eloquence of diction, and rapidity of elocution, positively amazing. The manner of delivery was perhaps a little jerky here and there, and she occasionally clenched her hand unnecessarily, but as a whole, the effect was most impressive, and I don't think anyone who heard her went away unimproved. At the conclusion she offered up another prayer, and then withdrew, accompanied by some half-dozen other pragmatic ladies in rich garments. As a preacher, she referred to herself as God's ambassadress, claiming that she was a sinner saved by grace through faith in the Lamb of God. Given Laura's previous stature and position, many papers reported on her conversion, and the American magazine Harper's wrote the following on her in 1867. Laura Bell, who was the heroine of London letters 4 or 5 years ago, who drove exquisite equipages and gave ravishing suppers, and fluttered for a tinsel hour, became converted, as read in a late London letter, and now in an exquisite dress, but with faded beauty and angular features, preaches to men and women with eager concern. She gets good society to her dinner parties, and talks over human depravity with earls and marquises, and kisses pious countesses upon the cheek. It was in the mid-1860s that Laura and Gladstone became close friends. They wrote frequently to one another, and he attended her dinners with other politicians at Grosvenor Square. In time, though, this friendship began to spark gossip, with many of Gladstone's rivals claiming that they were having an affair. In truth, it's impossible to know the exact nature of their relationship, as most of their correspondence was destroyed, but it's generally believed that it was purely platonic, and built on the common ground of helping prostitutes. Throughout their 30-year friendship, Laura would tell Gladstone everything there was to know about her, from the intimate details of her childhood running wild, to being coerced from a young age into sexual relationships with older men. This tragic and wild youth fascinated Gladstone, and he thoroughly enjoyed being in her company, which is why he visited her so often. By the time Gladstone was in his 80s, he had amassed hundreds of letters from Laura, and even an autobiography, which she wrote for him. Whether or not this friendship bothered her husband is unknown, but it was no secret that Frederick and Laura's marriage was not a happy one. They had been estranged from each other for some time, and Laura would host lavish parties in London, while he spent most of his time hunting in Scotland. As was typical for Laura, she couldn't stop her huge spending and continued to rack up large debts. Fed up, Frederick would constantly cut her off from his credit, and marital issues continued for years until tragedy struck. On the 7th of August 1887, Frederick was found dead at his home in Grosvenor Square. Bizarrely, he was known to have kept a pistol on his bedside table, which he would shoot into the ceiling to summon the servants. The coroner determined that Frederick had stumbled against the table and accidentally shot himself. He was 57 years old at the time of his death. A Yorkshire paper stated the following regarding his passing. On Sunday night, Mr. E.F. Thistlethwaite, Grosvenor Square, London, who was in the habit of keeping a loaded revolver on a table by his bedside, was seized with a fainting fit, stumbled against the table, knocked down the pistol, and caused it to explode with a fatal result to himself. This again caused people to gossip, and they wondered whether it was truly an accident. Laura was in an unhappy marriage, and her husband had been accused of sleeping with other women, so perhaps she was responsible. Others believed it may have been a suicide, but this speculation didn't change anything. Following her husband's death, Laura continued to preach and lecture young girls. She received just over £70,000 from her late husband's will, which is around £6 million today. She went on to sell the house in Grosvenor Square and moved to Woodbine Cottage in West Hampstead, which Frederick had bought in 1881. She would never remarry. Eventually, Laura passed away at home on the 30th of May 1894, aged around 64. Prior to her death, she had left instructions that her coffin should bear her name as Laura Eliza Seymour. Laura was buried in her husband's family vault in Paddington Cemetery, Willesden Lane. After her death, Gladstone's solicitors retrieved nearly all of his letters to her, and Gladstone himself burned the letters in the autobiography she had written for him, fearing that they may be misunderstood. Certain newspaper society gossip sections reported on Laura's passing. One stated the following about her: her striking beauty, her rich and mellifluous voice, and her splendid figure made her a most powerful and persuasive evangelist. For between 30 and 40 years, her house was the centre of much religious activity. Many of the leading men of the day, both in politics and religion, were her visitors. Mr. Gladstone, for one, was profoundly struck by the intense earnestness and spirituality of her character, and was not an infrequent visitor at her house. Thank you everyone for watching this video on Laura Bell. I hope you found it interesting. Let me know what you thought of her life down below in the comments, and if you have any other suggestions, also leave them in the comments. I hope you guys are subscribed and have notifications turned on to get all my videos as soon as I upload them. And I'm sure you heard Lola Montez in the video mentioned, and I've also done a video of her, so be sure to check that out on the channel. Anyway, that's all from me, so I'll see all of you in the next Forgotten Life. Thanks.